Hello, Scott Sigrist again. Um, Welcome to the third lecture on Just War. As you can see, it's been a few days since the second one. I've changed my shirt and grown a beard, but I'm back. We've been discussing um, the first two. There's three categories of Just War, and we've been discussing jus ad bellum, meaning justice in going to war, uh, just cause, basically. And then jus post bellum, um, justice in concluding the war. After the war, what are you going to do? How are you going to set things up or leave things for the community that you've just defeated? Now we're going to jus in bello, or right conduct during wartime. Um, and I know my main audience here, some of you are military veterans. You fought in combat. Um, and so I proceed with some caution here. Um, Let me start with some preliminary considerations. And first of all, I have no experience in combat, though I have had close friends uh, who have. I had taught 3 years at West Point, and a couple of my roommates uh, were active military guys. One of them in special forces, who was often in the hot zones in Afghanistan. In particular, both of them had been to Iraq during the fighting there, but I have not. And so my perspective is limited in an important respect, right? I've read accounts of uh, battlefield situations and what soldiers have gone through. Uh, I make an effort of sympathetic imagination to put myself in their shoes. And I have personally experienced great suffering in other areas, but I don't know what it's like to be in a hot zone. I don't know what the heat of battle feels like. I have never personally experienced the fog of war, and so I come to this with a certain degree of humility. Um, I think humility is necessary in talking about these things. Unfortunately, a lot of just war theorist Walter mentioned this. It was one of his criticisms of the left. There's often a kind of self-righteous um, tone to some of the people who discuss just war theory and, in particular, war crimes. Um, and and he actually ends the book. If you noticed, Walzer in his in a later edition takes up some of the just war theorists who have been um, thinking that Walzer himself and the Orthodox tradition, which he, more or less represents, have been too loose in their um, um, strictures on the actions of soldiers in the field. And he tries there to, in that last part of the book, to um, suggest that they don't understand the wartime situation, and their approach to it is too academic and not concrete enough in recognizing the unique um, situations um, that come up in the context of combat. And I think humility in discussion of this is necessary. Uh, I think no one is competent to comment on in bello decision making who doesn't first engage in sympathetic imagination, as I was talking about, trying to put yourself in those shoes, um, and secondly, recognizing the extreme difficulty of combat decision making. So why listen to me on this? If since I haven't been in combat, um, aside from the efforts I've mentioned that I've made, um, you could consider my role analogous to that of a pastor or priest uh, dealing with someone who's experienced a great loss, mourners and so forth. Right? And a good pastor or priest realizes that it's not appropriate uh, ever to say, "I know how you feel," even if they've gone through a similar thing themselves. Nobody knows how someone personally feels. Everyone has unique emotional responses, and so a good pastor or priest will stick to his area of expertise. That is his role. To the extent someone seeks it, he tries to speak to what he knows, which is matters of the spirit and things like how to find hope and insight uh, in the face of tragedy, right? And so that's my what I can offer is my area of expertise, which is moral philosophy. And I'm not here concerned here to judge, but to empower people seeking uh, assistance. Um, so that's how I see my role here. My purpose is not to second guess hard decisions, but to point out approach paths for doing two things. First, to clarify moral thinking, um, to learn from past events so that we may prepare for future challenges, right? First of all. And second, addressing moral anxieties. I mean, people have a great deal of soldiers have a great deal of moral anxiety about what they do on the battlefield. I think this a great deal of PTSD, the post traumatic post traumatic. I'm drawing a blank. You know what it means. Um, in general post combat agony. A lot of it, I think, it relates to a lot of things. Right? But a lot of it relates to unresolved moral anxieties. People know that they're killing human beings, and it's traumatic to do that, as well as to see your own comrades shot down and killed in sometimes horrible ways, right? Um, but psychologically, it doesn't work to run from these questions, and to work through things in moral reflection. I believe helps. And I think this is something that um, in terms of counseling and things people have done uh, in trying to help vets afterwards, which is we don't do a good job of at all of helping uh, post combat vets. And generally speaking, this is one thing that I don't think is provided, and maybe it's just a factor of not having the kind of philosophical background that could inform that kind of help. Um, so anyway, that all that is preliminary uh, um, disclaimer, if you will. Um, let's start with, in terms of jus in bello, the central problem. I think clarifying that the central problem is this: trying to respect the humanity of individual uh, enemy soldiers and non-combatants, both, versus the imperative of winning and the risk to your own soldiers. Right? This is, I mean, if you shouldn't go to war unless it's important to win the war, right? So there is a real imperative of winning, and war is horrible, and uh, you don't want to have to be there if you can help it. But if you're there, you want to protect your people, right? And it's legitimate, I think, to prioritize the safety of your own. Um, and you might ask, well, in view of the humanity of all participants in warfare, or everyone caught up in warfare, how do you justify prioritizing your own? Well, I think maybe a good way to think about this is in terms of concentric circles of concern, right? We have a special responsibility for those under our care, right? And we can't be as responsible for everyone else because they're not under our they're not in our immediate domain, and we have less control over them, and we have less knowledge of their situation and their needs and so forth. Um, so it's legitimate, I think, to prioritize the safety of your own. But then you might ask, why take risks uh, for the preservation of the lives uh, and the health of non-combatants, even enemy soldiers in certain circumstances, right? Well, in the case of non-combatants, it's because they're at your mercy. Um, if they have a gun and they're pointing it at you, regardless of whether they have a uniform on, they are not non-combatants, right? The definition, by definition, non-combatants are people who are not engaged in combat, right? And that's the reason for taking the risks, right? We don't have to take a risk not to kill foreign or enemy soldiers in combat because they have guns. They're in this situation. Everybody knows that's that's the situation. Um, and so um, and it's the same reason for not killing prisoners and so forth among the enemy soldiers. They're at your mercy, right? Um, so yeah, so your two categories are enemy soldiers and non-combatants in terms of jus in bello. Um, with regard to enemy soldiers, I think the general idea is that there's a time to kill, which is combat situations, and there's a time not to kill, right? So you have combat and non-combat situations. Walter considered that naked soldier scenario, right? That soldier taking a bath, right, on the enemy soldier, and you've got him in your gun sights, and you realize that you could take him out right now, right? Um, and but the guy is helpless, right? He's at your mercy, though he doesn't know it. Um, and so it creates a kind of a moral, at least disturbance, right? And in your mind. And um, Walter acknowledges that that's there are legitimate reasons, perhaps, to take out um, an enemy soldier who is in that kind of situation. Um, and we won't go into all of the reasoning. You've read the book, um, but it is there's at least some, perhaps, moral difference between that kind of scenario and an active, um, hot conflict in the combat zone, right? And then the easier cases, your prisoners or your wounded that you have under your control of enemy fighters, and that's that principle again. If they're at your mercy, if they don't have any means to defend themselves, if they're in your care, and um, with regard to people who have surrendered, they've surrendered on the understanding, which is the war convention, right? That uh, they will not be killed or badly mistreated. That's why they surrendered, right? Um, that's enemy soldiers. The non-combatants. The general idea is, I think you could sum up in terms of the term Walter used: do care to minimize casualties, right? And the do is important there, right? Do entails military necessity, right? If it doesn't serve a military necessity, you shouldn't. Uh, that's off limits to kill. Um, But do also implies obligations not only to the non-combatants but to your own soldiers, right? So due care, reasonable care, that's right. Uh, it's taken for granted by everyone that there will be collateral damage, there will be non-combatants who die, and maybe a lot of them. But the key point is that you should minimize that as much as reasonably possible, right? Well, that brings up the question of necessity. I mean, when is it necessity to when is it necessary to override uh, this general principle and and uh, deliberately take out non-combatants, deliberately kill them, right? Well, I think it might be helpful to see this necessity along a spectrum, right? Um, from no necessity at all to uh, what what Walzer calls supreme emergency, right? Uh, none. If there's no necessity at all for it, then it's just gratuitous violence, right? It's just there's no excuse for that at all. Uh, and if it's a supreme emergency, it allows for a great deal more deliberate targeting uh, of non-combatants, right? That in that scenario, that is one scenario where that may be permissible, right? And I think if you look at it in terms of a spectrum, most most people will say, oh, okay, yeah, I mean the proper place is somewhere in between no necessity and absolute necessity if you're going to avoid um, absolute catastrophe, right? So, in terms of necessity, I think you want to ask two questions. You want to ask, for what? Uh, for what would you do this thing uh, that it comes a possibility of doing, um, and whether it's really necessary. Uh, and I think, in general, Walzer wants to suggest that there are a lot of people who make the argument of necessity that they they're too quick uh, to appeal to necessity. That in many cases it's not really necessary um, to uh, neglect the safety of non-combatants, right? Um, and maybe a good way to look at this uh, in terms of you know what you're doing, what you have to do during combat. I think it helps to look at it in terms of um, your own response to that kind of situation is a question of orientation, right? I think it's essential in determining real necessity for extreme measures in difficult situations um, to take extreme measures as an undesirable last resort, right? Rather than something you're eager to do or indifferent uh, in using, right? Shrugging off or holding in contempt the principle of due care, right? And here I'd remind you again, in terms of orientation, just a psychological outlook. I gave you that illustration of Agamemnon and how he was told to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. Well, he was told to sacrifice his daughter. Iphigenia was the one who happened to be there. Um, and I mentioned to you how Aeschylus presents this as something he had to do, right? But he shouldn't have enjoyed it, or he shouldn't have endorsed it as in and of itself. He shouldn't have done what he did, which was conclude that, well, since the god has commanded it, then therefore I must do it with enthusiasm, right? It has to do with orientation, right? Um, Maybe horrible things have to be done sometimes. But the question is, I mean, if you come at it with this kind of orientation of wanting to do due diligence and take due care uh, not to unnecessarily, gratuitously harm uh, non-combatants, right? Then you're with that orientation, you're less inclined to abuse your power in that situation, perhaps. Now, here's a good place to take up Machiavelli. Um, a fundamental criticism that's been made of Machiavelli is not so much that he uh, acknowledges a need for extreme measures. Um, in the supreme emergency scenario, Walter suggests that yes, indeed, there may be a necessity for it, right, for extreme measures, leaving that undefined for the moment. The problem with Machiavelli is he takes his bearings from the extreme case rather than the normal case, right? I mean, his moral um, his moral starting point, or his the process of moral reason, looks at the extreme case and makes conclusions from there, rather than looking at the normal case, from which the extreme case would be uh, an, a rare exception to the rule, right? This goes along with the orientation that I'm suggesting, right? Um, the I mean, war itself is not a normal case, right? Of action. You do things in war. It's everybody knows that you will have to do things in war that it would be wrong to do in peacetime, right? And that will be a necessity. It will be a necessity even to do justice, right? But even in wartime, um, there are normal cases, and there are extreme cases, right? Um, and this extreme case, the supreme necessity, is where you're forced into a genuinely dichotomous choice between um, crime and disaster. The only way to avoid disaster, and again, disaster is something that I'll leave undefined at the moment, but the only choice is between disaster or crime, right? Doing what, according to the War Convention, would be a criminal act. Um, and the point is that that's relatively rare that you literally those are your only two options. Um, and you can look at what Walter says in terms of concrete scenarios to sort that out and how he defines supreme emergency. But it makes a difference, orientation wise, if you start from thinking about the normal case, what's normal in wartime, in terms of wartime necessity, and what is um, unusual. Right? No decisions for killing people presumably are easy, right? But there are some situations that are genuine moral dilemmas and genuine um, forced choices between two terrible possibilities, right? Um, Let me give you an example of a non-military extreme case, maybe to help clarify a little bit. It's not a military example, but it is related to a war, and that is the use of waterboarding um, after just after 9/11 to um, to get information. Right, the distinctive feature about battling terrorism is that there is a there is a premium on intelligence that is beyond anything you have in any other military context, right? I mean, in conventional war, you know who the enemy is. You know, generally speaking, or at least much more of the time, where the enemy is. You can recognize the enemy. They're wearing a uniform and so on. It's not the case in terrorism. In terrorism, it depends upon not being recognized, coming out of nowhere, right? Everybody, not just military people, being constantly at risk of attack, right? Um, and and in the case of terrorism, it's no good to wait until the attack is imminent, right? Because it's too late. You have to get information before the fact, right? And therefore, the Geneva Convention that says, um, a soldier only has to give prisoner of war, only has to give name, rank, and serial number. That will not cut it in the case of a terrorist detainee, right? So, there here, waterboarding. It's interesting to look at what the Bush administration did in terms of, they brought in lawyers and looked at what actually constitutes torture, and what the criterion they decided on was whether it causes permanent harm um, to an individual, and if it did, it would be classified as torture, and if it didn't, it would fall short. It would be classified as enhanced interrogation techniques, right? And waterboarding fell into that category, at least according to physical damage. Waterboarding didn't have any permanent physical damage. There are people who claim that it has can cause permanent psychological damage. I know that a lot of our special forces are waterboarded as part of their trainees for part of the training for knowing how to handle torture if you get in that scenario yourself. And one of my friends who has gone through this said, "I think it should be off limits." He found it that traumatic. Um, but I think that there are the three considerations for using this kind of, compared to normal cases, extreme measure, right? First is the extremity of the situation. I mean, how dangerous is the immediate situation? Secondly, what are the means available? Thirdly, what is the likelihood of success for this technique? Okay, so the first thing to note here is that waterboarding is very effective in getting people to talk. The question is whether they tell you the truth. But my understanding is that waterboarding has a 100% success rate in making people talk. And this can make it very effective for someone who has no training or doesn't know what to do about it. If they're caught off guard, right? They don't know that this kind of thing is coming, right? And this was the case with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, generally considered to be the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. Right, we had him in our custody. The Bush administration admitted that they used waterboarding on him, right? And part of the thinking about this was the extremity of the situation. After 9/11, everybody thought there would be further attacks. We didn't know when, we didn't know where, we didn't know if how late in the stages of planning. We didn't know if where all the cells were, the sleeper cells as they called them. These guys who have been waiting around for years before the 9/11 attack, and the kind of situation they were there. And it was analogous to what is sometimes called the time bomb scenario. So let's say you have um, strong evidence to suggest that there is a dirty bomb uh, being prepared in the city right now to go off anytime now, right? That's an extreme situation. That's a situation in which if you don't get that information immediately, there could be huge loss of life, right? So that's a case of um, what Walter is calling the supreme emergency scenario. And you've had even you may remember John McCain was opposed to waterboarding. John McCain, a veteran himself, he'd been in the Hanoi Hilton, right? He had been tortured by the Viet Cong um, during the Vietnam War, and he was opposed to waterboarding. When he was pressed on this question, what about that ticking time bomb scenario? I said, well, then you've got to do what it takes, right? So this is a scenario in which a lot more people will be willing to contemplate the use of what might be considered by many to be torture, right? The second question is the means available. Are there other less extreme means available? Um, if there are, and if this goes with the likelihood of success thing, if other available means may be just as effective, do you have perhaps a responsibility uh, to use those other methods, right? And among extreme measures, are some less inhumane than others? Waterboarding, I think you might get near universal agreement on, is not quite as inhumane as cutting off fingers or bamboo shoots under the fingernails, etc. Um, so, and then in terms of likelihood of success, well, I mean, you can ask about torture or uh, these extreme techniques, um, how effective they are. I mean, you have a lot of professionals, in the interrogation business telling you that um, torture is actually not that effective, right? Because especially over the long run, if anyone who knows it's coming, right, can train themselves to have things to say, the false things to say that will mislead. And so, just as a practical matter, utilitarian question, the success is questionable, um, right? So these are the kind of considerations I think you bring into play, and the general point is that if it's not really genuinely necessary to use a more extreme approach, then you shouldn't. Right. Let me give a little bit more of a practical touch on a more practical example that soldiers are I mean, much more central to their experience. And that is the issue of rules of engagement, right? Um, and I don't want to say much about this, um, but I would uh, I would suggest maybe a good way to think of this again is on a spectrum. Um, I think if you're willing to, if you're not a pacifist and you're willing to suggest that weapons occasionally must be used and that they occasionally will cause collateral damage, which I think any realistic person is probably going to do, then that implies necessarily that you your rules of engagement have to include actual engagement sometimes, right? So you can conceive a spectrum again between absolute prohibition against uh, firing uh, to no rules whatsoever. Fire at will, um, and And so I think we should be able to take for granted that um, you can have rules of engagement that are too uh, open, too open-ended, and also rules of engagement that are too restrictive. What constitutes overly restrictive has a lot to do with, well, it's the kind of thing that can't be determined beforehand. I mean, it depends on what kind of weapons you're using. It depends on what kind of situation you're in, and so forth. There may be political considerations. There may be, certainly will be a question of how things work on the battlefield, and a lot of discretion there. Um, so I think this uh, you Walter brings up the sliding scale and the question of uh, you know uh, how does he put it? Utilitarian considerations, military necessity, and proportionality, or, or or what degree of force is necessary to achieve the necessary end, right? Um, and he cautions against the uh, possibility of sort of a slippery slope there if you leave things too open-ended. But I think that's part of the point. I mean, he does acknowledge that that's a starting point in your moral reasoning about these questions, uh, about uh, jus in bello, that utilitarian consideration, what does it take to win, is important. Um, also, uh, proportionality is important. Um, and so and they're relative, right? I mean, proportionality has to do with what's necessary to achieve the end, right? Um, I think the critical thing for him is morally, this is the beginning point at least, not the end point, but that those things be kept together. That you can't think of proportionality without concern for the imperative of winning. You shouldn't think about utilitarian uh, considerations without thinking about proportionality, right? Um, and if you do that, then the sliding scale does not become a slippery slope, provided you bring in some of the other points that he mentions um, about due care and so on. Right. So I think if you'll think in these spectrum terms, it helps. I mean, if you speak of it in abstract, um, without regard for concrete scenarios um, and real necessities and so on, then it's easy to fall on one side or the other, come to one extreme or the other. So, demanding too much restriction or demanding not enough, right? If you think about it on this scale, and if you once admit that it's got to be somewhere in between, uh, you know, uh, no shooting under any circumstances, and no rules whatsoever. We just kill at will, men, women, children, regardless of their situation, regardless of whether it's necessary. If you think it's somewhere in between there, then you have acknowledged that there is a need for moral reasoning. Right? That's a critical point. And that's the absolute requirement. The absolute requirement in jus ad bello, and in these other categories too, the jus ad bellum and the jus post bellum. The one absolute is that you must employ moral reasoning. Right? The conclusions cannot be determined beforehand because circumstances are always of paramount importance, right? But that to employ moral reasoning, to keep the humanity of all individuals uh, in mind, and to avoid gratuitous and unnecessary infliction of harm, right? Reasoning about these things. That's the one thing that is absolutely non-negotiable, right? Okay, so just some concluding thoughts on the value of just war theory. Um, First of all, I think it's important for upholding our own ideals as Americans, right? Our Declaration of Independence, uh, the truths we hold uh, that we stated in the Declaration of Independence, of human equality and of universal natural rights and so forth. That's how we have defined ourselves. That's who we are. Right. So upholding our own ideals. This is a factor. We those truths were put forth as universally true. Right. You said we hold them because we can see these. Okay, Hobbes doesn't see this or whatever. But we, because of our own reflection, our own experience, have come to see that these things are true, and we hope that the rest of the world will come to see that these are true as well. So upholding our ideals. Second, living with ourselves. Right. Um, I think a sense of responsibility for our actions and confidence and pride go hand in hand, right? Both individually and nationally. Um, Taking responsibility need not, and indeed should not, mean uh, endless hand wringing and apology tours, um, to say nothing of self-flagellation, right? Uh, I think what it means is striving to live up to our best selves, right? And then preparing ourselves, right? Most likely we will all, both soldiers and civilians, again have to face the hard choices of war, and they are hard choices, right? Um, but these choices are much harder when we've never engaged in systematic moral reflection, and the time for that is now. The time for that is when you have leisure apart from war and the combat situation, right? It's harder to engage in moral reflection in wartime. It's harder to find time, and it's harder to be objective about it, right? And it's usually impossible in a combat zone. So now is the time to do it, right? And I hope that in studying it, you found it's worthwhile. Okay, that's enough on just war. Um, and my final video for the grad class here, um, I will see you on discussion board and elsewhere. Bye.